Hi, everyone. I see you are joining us a little bit at a time. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you. And I am Lynell Seabold, the director of the Ava Gardner Museum. I'm very happy to be the one to welcome you to our very first in a series we call Ava Chats. Our topic today is interpreting Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. Ava Gardner shot this film in England and Spain in 1950. And she starred alongside James Mason, Mario Cabré, Sheila Sim, Nigel Patrick, and Harold Warrender. In 2020, Cohen Media restored Pandora in 4K. And in celebration of the re-release, the Ava Gardner Museum has dedicated a new exhibit to the film. Today, we have two special guests joining us to talk about the history of the film, Ava's experiences making it, and the development of our new exhibit. Lora Stocker is a member of the museum's board of directors, and she also functions as the museum's social media strategist. She is an artist, designer, and illustrator who operates her independent design business based in Eastern North Carolina. Beth Nevarez is the collections manager at the Ava Gardner Museum. She has a master's degree in public history and specializes in caring for historical collections and sharing history through collections outreach initiatives. She also operates Beth Nevarez Historical Consulting. I will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to post any questions throughout our talk on the message board. And as time permits, we will answer questions at the end of the discussion. We will also our chat with a post on our blog at avagardner.org. So please be sure to look for that. And now I will turn the discussion over to Beth and Lora. Hi, ladies.
Hello. Thank you, Lynell.
Thank you.
As Lynell said, we've recently opened a new exhibit all about Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. So we're really excited to talk a little bit about that exhibit today, as well as take a deep dive into the film itself, the creative team who's responsible for the film, Ava's experience of filming, the restoration that recently came out in 2020. We're going to touch on all of that. We spent a lot of time researching Pandora and rewatching it, and we loved it so much. We thought it would make a wonderful topic for our first episode of Ava Chats. It may go without saying, but spoiler alert, you've had since 1951 to see this film, but we will be talking about, specific scenes, and we may give away how it ends. So I just wanted to warn you, so you can't be mad at us. And don't forget, Lynell, we can't see her, but she's there monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, leave them there and we'll get to them at the end if we have time. So let's dive in. Lora, let's start with Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, how it fits into Ava's career. Could you tell us a little bit about where Ava was in her career when she made this film?
Sure. Some of our viewers, and welcome everyone, thanks for joining us, may know her story. She sort of rose from somewhat obscurity in rural North Carolina as a teenager and got a MGM contract based off of a photo that was in a window in a photo studio in New York. And, her rise to Hollywood starlet is a movie in and of itself. But basically, she ended up going to Hollywood at age 19 in 1941 with a 7-year contract. And it took about 5 years for her to gain a little bit of footing in Hollywood. Most of that first 5 years were bit roles and uncredited kind of walk-on. She did a ton of now famous pinup photos of every shape and size and celebrating every holiday imaginable. But in 1946, that was really kind of what we identify as her breakout year. She had 2 films that came out that year that were film noir. First was Whistle Stop, and her performance in that actually led to her getting cast in The Killers. Both of those films were loan outs from MGM Studios. But those films really just made audiences go gaga, and that really set her on the path to becoming the kind of mega international star that we know today. Leading up to Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, she had several great films that came out in 1949. The Bribe, which I'm sure some of our guests or our attendees have watched before. Also, her first teaming with Gregory Peck in The Great Sinner, and her first teaming with James Mason in a film called East Side, West Side. all three of those films did well and continued to help her kind of on her path to leading lady, to a more substantial leading lady. In 1950, she filmed Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. She actually didn't have a theatrical release in 1950, but she had 3 films come out in 51, My Forbidden Past, Showboat, and Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. One of the significant things about Pandora is that that was her first lead in a Technicolor film. You know, today we're used to seeing pictures of her in color, so we know, you know, she's beautiful in black and white, but she's stunning in color. Her green eyes just stand out, her beautiful lush hair, and that just beautiful porcelain skin. You just can't help but be awed when you see her in color photos. But this is the first time that she had a lead in a Technicolor film. She had a small walk-on part, uncredited, in 1943's Dewberry Was a Lady. You gotta really watch to see her in that. But otherwise, this was the first time, and for this to be the first of her Technicolor films and to be filmed by the great cinematographer Jack Cardiff, who we'll get to in a minute, she just is luminous in this film, and it really wowed audiences. A little interesting tidbit is that the film was actually released first in the UK, and in Europe, European audiences got to see it first in 1951 before here. Here, MGM had the rights to release the film, and waited until Showboat came out, because that was one of their kind of big tent films that year. They thought that was really gonna, you know, do well, which it did, and she's in that as not the lead, but a secondary lead, and certainly a powerful performance. But we in the US saw her first in Showboat and then in Pandora, but it was kind of a 1-2 punch of Ava Gardner, big screen, lots of close-ups, full Technicolor. So this film really, you know, it fits into her kind of filmography as the beginning of the 1950s, the cusp of all of these great films that we really know her from today, like The Barefoot Contessa, Snows of Kilimanjaro, Mogambo. All of those films were subsequent ones right in the next year or two after this film.
Great. I'm hoping a lot of our participants have seen the film already, but I think I'll give just a brief sort of summary, just so you kind of know what we're talking about as we get into it. It's kind of hard to pinpoint genre-wise, but I would call it a supernatural romance, sort of a fantasy romance. In Pandora, Ava's character Pandora is an American living or visiting in Spain, and it's based around 1930. It was filmed in 50, but it's set in 1930. And she has this group of friends that are all either American or European, but not from Spain. And they all sort of revolve around her. She seems to be sort of this magnetic force, and all of the men in the group, most of the men, are head over heels in love with her, obsessed with her, and she's not interested in any of them. And then the Flying Dutchman comes on the scene, and they have this sort of predestined love, and that develops over the course of the film. So you think that's a pretty good summary, Laura? I know it's a complicated film.
We were prepping for this event. We were trying to, you know, we both rewatched the movie several times. As you mentioned, we've watched it countless times over the last 12 months, which has been wonderful. But there's a quotation early on in the film that the kind of narrator character named Jeffrey in the film, who's both an actor in it and also the narrator of it. You know, again, everybody who's seen the film, spoiler alert, the movie begins with the ending. You know what's going to happen to these, you know, kind of fated lovers. They die. Their bodies wash ashore, and then the whole film is told in flashback until the very end, when it goes back to what's current time in the film. And the line is, "The measure of love is what someone is willing to give up for it." And that is kind of a theme throughout the film, kind of the different explorations and the different experiences of love, jealousy, tenderness, obsession, fascination, you know, being disinterested, being overly interested, all of those sorts of things. And you're right, Pandora is the center of that world, and everything does sort of revolve around her interests, her you know, fascinations, her life events. And even though there's all these other kind of interesting characters, they do all gravitate toward her. So.
Yeah. And on a personal level, you talked about where Ava was in her career, but personally, this film was kind of pivotal for her and her personal life, she was very much in love with Frank Sinatra at the time. And it was also the first time she went abroad ever for filming or, travel or anything. And she got to go to London, Paris, and Spain. And she would end up later living in London and Spain. So it was really transformational in terms of, broadening her worldview and her idea of, how she'd like her life to be, basically. It was just a few years later, I think 53 is when she moved to Spain. So she fell in love with Spain, especially on that first trip abroad. The flamenco music, the culture, the people, all of it. And so when I'm sorry?
Bullfights.
Yes, bullfights. I think she says something about falling in love with the pageantry of the bullfights in her book. And so, a few years later, when she decided she needed to get away from the Hollywood scene, it was to Spain that she moved. So it was really very personally impactful on her, for sure. And part of why it was filmed in Spain was because the director, Albert Lewin, also kind of wanted to get away from the Hollywood studio system. He wanted to kind of work outside of that and do something different and creative. And I know that in all of our research, you've become a big Al Lewin fan. And he's a really interesting director, writer, artist, sort of very creative. So could you talk a little bit about his background and how his vision for this film came to life?
Sure. He's not someone that is kind of easily recognizable like some of his other contemporaries, that were working within the Hollywood system at the time, and that people, of course, think of like Hitchcock or those kinds of directors of that name. He only made a few films. He made 6 in total. But he was around Hollywood for a long time. He started out, first of all, he came from the East Coast. He came from a working class Jewish family and was very intellectual, very intelligent, and ended up going to NYU and to Harvard, had a degree in English literature, and then ultimately worked as a critic, a drama critic, and then various things happened and he ended up in Hollywood. And he worked as a script reader and then ultimately as an assistant to famed producer Irving Thalberg at MGM. But he worked at MGM and he also worked some at Paramount. So he just kind of worked his way up. He had quite a, kind of did a little bit of everything, wore a lot of different hats and had a lot of experiences that ultimately led him to decide he wanted to direct. And then once he directed, he wanted to write and produce. But luckily he had kind of had experience and been around the studio system long enough that he had, and of course working with Thalberg, he had kind of the best examples he could get and the best kind of on the job learning he could get. One of the film that he's probably most well known for today is the Picture of Dorian Gray, which came out in 1945. He did 3 films in the 40s and then 3 films in the 50s. And his films in the 40s were all shot in black and white. They really focused on male protagonists. He dealt with a lot of the same things themes of obsession and love and that sort of decadence and that kind of thing that translated also into his work in the 50s. But in the 50s, he started kind of exploring more of the feminine side of things. So his protagonists were female and again, similar concepts and themes of obsession and all that sort of stuff. But he did work within the studio system his first couple years as a director, and he just felt it very constricting, as a lot of other creatives did at the time. And he, like you said, he just wanted to kind of get away and do something independent. And when this story came along, this was his first original screenplay. And it's, as you said, it's a film that kind of defies convention and definition. It's very intellectual. It's very, has very much of a European sensibility to it, and also, elements of fantasy and mythology and supernatural elements and that kind of thing. And the studio system wasn't real keen on it. They didn't really want to do it. They thought, what is this wild movie that you've come up with? And he had trouble getting financial support from MGM. So he had a contractual relationship with them to do another film. And this is what he wanted to do. So he ended up making an arrangement where if you'll let me go do this, or, you know, kind of release me from things and I'll go do this independently, my payout will be that you let me cast Ava Gardner in it. So that was how it worked. So that's how she ended up being in this film, that she was the payout, but he just thought she was the perfect Pandora. And you know, for anyone who's seen the movie, she absolutely is. No one else, I can't imagine anyone else of her contemporaries being able to capture and put on the screen what she was able to do with her performance in this. So he was right. But to make this movie and to make it the way he wanted to make it, he needed to leave Hollywood, and he went scouting and found the Costa Brava area of Spain where this was shot. And he wrote home to his mother and said, "It's as if God knew my story and made the Costa Brava for me to film Pandora." So it's a beautiful film that it is shot on location, and you know, they got everybody out of Hollywood and made it over there. And he just needed that freedom to make the film that he had envisioned.
And so he was the writer and director, but the creative team also included Jack Cardiff, who you mentioned earlier, who amazing cinematographer. This was the first time Jack and Ava worked together, but they worked also on The Barefoot Contessa. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but I love what Ava says about him and how he could film your soul if there was just enough light. I love that quote. And she loved him as a cinematographer. And really, if you've seen the film, especially the 2020 restoration, his cinematography work is amazing. The colors, the light, he really wasn't like a master of working with light. He's well known as a cinematographer for women, for actresses, for really bringing out their natural beauty on screen. And could you speak a little bit more about, I know you know a little bit more about his background and that sort of thing.
You know, he was around a long time, similar to Lewin. He had quite a pedigree when you look over his full resume. He actually started working as a child in music halls, which are kind of the equivalent of our vaudeville music halls in England when he was a little boy, and ultimately was in some silent films and sort of made his way as a kind of child actor, and then got on the, you know, in the production behind the scenes side of things. And really kind of gravitated toward what ultimately became his career in cinematography. Did a little bit of everything in the range of that career before he ended up becoming a full-fledged cinematographer. But he was the first British cinematographer trained in using Technicolor, and he truly became a master of it. He had a very long career. He ultimately did direct and had an Oscar nomination for his directing, but today he's probably primarily known for, obviously we think he's best known for Pandora and The Barefoot Contessa, but he worked with the filmmakers Powell and Pressburger with London Films, and made some really pivotal films that today, when people think of Technicolor, they think of these films, A Matter of Life and Death, The Red Shoes, and Black Narcissus, which he actually won an Oscar for. But he was just a very inventive person. He did a lot of, he did everything he did with the camera. This was, you know, no CGI, no special effects kind of thing. It was all done with the tools they had, the tools of the trade then, and he used a lot of filters and other things. And what's interesting about Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, you know, before this film was restored, some of the kind of lesser quality versions of it, which is what a lot of us, you know, if we caught it on TV, first time I saw it was as a kid on TV, you didn't get the full sense of how beautiful of a film it was because it felt very dark. Because a lot of the scenes are set at either dusk or nighttime. And a lot of those scenes are outdoor scenes. So, you know, you had to deal with elements basically, but the film was actually, they did a lot of things within it, you know, with filters and all that, but mainly what's called day for night shooting. So they shot during the day, but it was a night scene. So they used filters and dissolves and other things to make it have that kind of in between, you know, moodiness of dusk or sunrise, you know, that kind of time of day where it's where it's hard to define what time it is, which is sort of appropriate for the themes and some of the other things we'll get to in a minute about the film as in and of itself. But it was very inventive, and as you said, he was a woman, considered kind of the man who could make women beautiful, and he worked with Ava, Sophia Loren, Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn. He really had quite the illustrious career, and Ava loved working with him, and it's as beautiful as she was in so many of her films, she was never more luminous than she is in this film.
And while we're talking about the creative team behind the film, we have to mention the artist Man Ray. He wasn't sort of, I guess, directly involved in sort of a specific role, but he and Albert Lewin were friends, and Albert Lewin was familiar with Man Ray's artistic work, which was kind of on the surrealist trend. He didn't call himself part of that movement, but he definitely was inspired by and took from that movement. And he his art, can be seen and specifically seen in the film, but also just his influence can be seen in a number of ways. Could you speak a little bit to that? I know you're familiar with that artistic influence of Man Ray.
Our Ava Chats just on this one subject because it runs deep. But yes, so Man Ray was an artist, as you mentioned. He kind of dabbled in surrealism, dabbled in Dadaism, and a bunch of other movements. He felt his work was kind of, again, beyond definition, kind of like Albert Lewin, but they were close friends. They both had a similar background. They both were from the East Coast, raised in Jewish working class families, both highly intelligent, well-read, very literate, and very aware of the anything topical of the day, interested in politics and religion and art and literature and anything contemporary and anything innovative. They both had passions for that, and they had a wonderful friendship, correspondence, and just a great relationship for many, many years. And Lewin really wanted to work with Man Ray and really kept trying to say, come out to Hollywood, let's do something in Hollywood. And he ultimately did end up in Hollywood for, I think, a little over a decade. He stayed there and worked in various capacities kind of in the war years and a little thereafter. But like I said, Lewin did want to work with Man Ray, and when he worked up this script, he was like, this is the one for us to partner on. And he did. Lewin approached Man Ray about a couple of projects that were going to be truly part of the film. Two in particular. Man Ray worked in every type of medium you can imagine. He was a painter. He did sculpting. He made games and things, which we'll talk about in a second, and was also a very noted photographer. So Lewin asked him to take some portraits, photographic portraits of Ava, and within the film there is the whole film is basically a flashback, but there's a flashback within the flashback, and it's going back to the origin story of the Flying Dutchman and how he became this kind of ghostly figure. And in that scene, you meet his wife, and his wife in the past is also portrayed by Ava. And in that, the director wanted to have some portraits of Ava made dressed as Dutch 16th, 17th century woman as the wife. So he took a series of portraits of her, one of which is actually used in the film. In profile, they're very much in the style of Renaissance miniatures of back then, but it is a photograph. It's not a painting. So anyway, so that was one task. And the other thing was, within the film, there's a plot point around the first time that James Mason's character and Ava Gardner's characters meet. James Mason is painting a large-scale canvas painting of the mythical figure of Pandora. And that particular painting that's used in the film was originally Lewin wanted Man Ray to paint that. And so he had Ava sit for him, and he did a series of sketches and ultimately made a portrait. And there's some photographs in our exhibit, and people can find that have you see what that painting looked like. and you see Ava posing for Man Ray. There's a series of photographs of that when she's in Man Ray's studio in Hollywood. And once Jack Curtis saw the painting, it wasn't really what he wanted. So he wrote a really nice letter saying, thanks, but no thanks. And so it was not used in the finished film, and someone else within the production did the painting. And then the third element where he has a presence in the film is in the 1920s, Man Ray designed and sculpted this really unique but surrealist inspired chess set. And that one of those chess sets is used in the film with the character of Jeffrey, the narrator. He has that in his cabana and is playing chess when James Mason's character comes to visit him. So those are the three kind of specific things that are in the film. But other than that, his influence is very much present in the narrative themes and the structure of the film, or kind of disconnected structure of the film that falls under to the concepts of surrealism. And those were things, because of their friendship and their kind of influence on each other, him being very much into surrealism at the time, and those ideas really informed the film, and if you want to talk a little bit about some of those, we can kind of both talk about some of the elements in the film that are identified as kind of surrealist touches.
Yeah, the narrative, like you mentioned, the flashbacks, and it covers 6 months of time, but you don't really feel that. And there's all sorts of symbolism worked all throughout the film. And I think that's what makes the film so special, is this extreme attention to detail. I mean, if you watch it closely, especially after someone like Lora has told you what to look for, nothing in this film seems accidental. Every single scene, every single setup, the backgrounds, the costumes, everything feels very deliberate, and it all points, to the themes that the film is expressing. And the costumes, especially Ava's costumes, really mirror the destiny, the predestined relationship between Ava's character and James Mason's, and that he was a sailor. And all of her costumes, or at least most of them, have some sort of element of marine. They either kind of mirror netting, like fish nets or fish scales or shells. And she's often seen looking towards the sea, being drawn literally into the sea to be with the Flying Dutchman, including a scene where she jumps into the ocean and swims out to his ship. So there's just this constant calling of this character Pandora to the sea to be with the Flying Dutchman. And there's tons of other little details. Lora, I know there's some more I'm not thinking of at the moment. What are some of those other really special symbolic touches throughout the film?
Sure. Yeah. Kind of thinking again on the surrealism spectrum, the film does have these elements of fragmentation, things being disconnected, the kind of disoriented nature of time and all that sort of stuff. But him, Lewin being such a fan of art and of aesthetic, treatment and symbolism and all of that, it's such a layered film, and it's one that you and I've had these conversations. It's like every time we watch it, it's like, ooh, I've got to text Beth and say, Beth, did you notice this? Or she'll text me, hey, did you see this? So there are all these really neat things. You mentioned the costuming, that the costumes were created by a British costume designer, Beatrice Dawson, who had a really long career and was nominated for an Oscar and BAFTAs, and was really talented. And these costumes are just stunning, and they do have elements of fish netting, of scales, of seashells, kind of iridescent elements that speak to the sea. And even in the way some scenes are shot, there's a scene early on in the film where she's wearing this particular dress, and as she walks away, it almost looks like the bottom of it looks like tentacles, which is really neat. But there are all these little touches within the film, and within kind of Lewin's cinematic universe, which is interesting. You know, we mentioned his kind of most famous work, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In that film, the nightclubs that Dorian visits is called the Two Turtles. And in Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, the nightclub is called
Las Dos Tortugas.
There we go. You're better.
Yes.
My southern accent prevents me from saying anything that's not English. I struggle with it. But anyway, yes, which translates as the Two Turtles. So that's kind of a neat little touch. There's a scene where Ava's playing the piano, and just kind of above the piano, it's very easy to miss, but there's just this little tiny piece of wall art that is got a Dutch windmill and a person wearing the wooden Dutch shoes and that sort of thing. So that's kind of, this is before she's met the Flying Dutchman, but that's kind of alluding to her destiny. The town name in the film is Esperanza, which translates as hope. And if you know the story, the story of the Pandora myth, the only thing left in Pandora's box after she opens it and unleashes all sorts of crazy mayhem on humanity is hope. So that's the town is hope. And there's a scene where in the flashback scene, James Mason's character talks about kind of searching for hope, looking for hope. And he's drawn to this town that's named Hope. And so that's just kind of an interesting, but there's just tons of things. And, we were talking recently and I said, last time I watched it, I noticed where the scene where Pandora meets James Mason Hendrick, when they meet the first time, is aboard Hendrick's yacht when he's come into port. And he's painting the painting we mentioned just a few minutes ago. And in the painting, Pandora is wearing a very pale yellow dress. When Pandora swims out to his boat to meet him, and she's curious, who's this guy that's come into port, that who's on this boat? And she gets on board the boat. She first she emerges wet and nude from the sea, but she puts on like a tarp and she goes down to meet him, and he just casually says, the dressing room's over there. And so she goes in and gets a robe, and she comes out, and she is wearing a pale yellow robe that is almost the exact color of the dress in the painting. And then later in the scenes where they finally confess their love for each other and act on it with a very passionate kiss and embrace, she is again wearing that very pale yellow thing. So there's just, with Lewin being such a fan of art and literature, and doing this kind of historical mashup film of this Dutch legend and this Greek mythology and kind of a travel log and all of that makes up this film. It being very literate, it's also within that, it's very layered. And it's just one of those films that every time you watch it, you find something new and something, of interest to explore and to kind of, look at that. So that's just I know there's more every time. So
I know the bells stand out to me because every time they ring in the film, it's either right after or right before someone dies. And you noticed that there was Alberto is on the bell, which is Albert Lewin, inserting himself into the film.
Into the movie, yeah, like Hitchcock would have done, where he's riding on a bus or something like that. You see him. That's Albert Lewin literally putting his name, his marker in the movie.
It's just so many little details. I'm sure there's a lot that we haven't even noticed yet, and just so symbolic. And I think that just makes it such a special film. And while we're still talking about it, what is your favorite scene from the film? Do you have a favorite scene?
Oh goodness, it changes every time you ask me this question. So, but my most recent viewing, I'm going to set aside this kind of the plot for a minute and set aside the passion of Ava and James and all their chemistry, and just say that I really enjoyed, on my most recent viewing, there are a series of vignettes within the film that they could easily be lifted out and taken out, and they don't really necessarily advance the plot per se, but they give you a sense of the place and the time and the culture in which these kind of, it's interesting. You don't really know, you know kind of what these people do. You know she was a nightclub singer, but apparently she's got enough money to be living on the coast of this beautiful little, paradise on the coast of Spain. And you've got Jeffrey, who's an archaeologist for working somewhere, apparently just has all this money. And then the other female character, Janet, who's related to Jeffrey, but you don't really know her backstory. Then you got this race car driver who's for some reason in this little town in Spain working on a race car, whatever. And then, a bullfighter, and then of course the Flying Dutchman. But all these people converge and are, they're the kind of they're the visitors to this place. And within the film, there is early on, there's a flamenco dance sequence and song that's performed in the little nightclub that they frequent. And then, of course, there's the bullfighting scenes. There's scenes with the fishermen at the beginning of the film and that sort of thing. And within those scenes, they don't, they speak their native tongue. They don't have, we don't know, if you can't speak the language, you don't know what they're saying. You can infer by the action, but the dance, all those scenes are just really beautifully filmed and very respectful of the town. We were talking previously about how a lot of films of this era and leading up to it, things coming out of the studio would really try to anglicize and make, in their minds, make it more palatable for an American audience. And you lost things with that. You lost the authenticity. And I think those little touches really add a beautiful sense of authenticity to the film. And they feel like they could be compiled together and made into a James Fitzpatrick travelogue kind of thing of the time. And they're just really beautiful. And I like that Lewin was kind and respectful in those moments to show, the passion and the culture of these people and their language and their music and all that, and not try to, Americanize it in any way. So what about you? What are some of your favorite scenes within the film?
There's a couple early on that I really liked just for how they set up Ava's character, Pandora. Really early scene. They're in their little bar they hang out in. And she sings in her real voice, which is also really nice. How Am I to Know? It's a beautiful song. And she sings it to this character, Reggie, who's not in the film for very long because, spoiler alert, he kills himself. Over Ava, or over Pandora. Even though she's been very clear that she's not in love with him and she's not interested, but he's just madly in love with her, the way most of the men in this film are. And she realizes what he's done sort of after the fact, and she's clearly very sad, but almost in an unsurprised way. She's not surprised that he's done this, but she is very sad. And this film, if you looked at it just sort of quickly and you didn't think too much about it, you might think that Ava's character is cold and uncaring. And I think, some critics at the time did read her that way. But, and then in the next scene as well, you could see where that people might get that. Because the next scene is also one of my favorites. She is in her home and these people come to visit her ostensibly to check in on her because they imagine that she's mourning this Reggie character. But she's happy as a clam and she's eating marshmallows, and the Janet character is just appalled that she's not more upset. But she explains it. He constantly was threatening suicide and clinging to her no matter what she told him. So she just had to kind of let him go. And so her character is just more complicated than I think a lot of female characters were at the time. And so I just love how they set her up. I don't know, she's just sort of otherworldly almost, and so all these men are gravitating towards her, and she's very clear that she's not interested, and she's a seeking character. Like she's really trying to figure out what it is that she wants, and she's trying to find it. And these men are just sort of casualties in the wake of that, no matter how many times she tells them that she's not interested. So those two scenes are also both really beautiful scenes that the light, especially in that marshmallow scene. That's what I call it, the marshmallow scene, is gorgeous. Those are my favorite.
You just want to join her for some marshmallows.
Yeah.
Sitting her cabana and eating marshmallows. I think you got at some really interesting things that we could expand on for just a minute, kind of the interpretation, how Ava interpreted the character and the way she performed it. I think is really interesting. And I think you're right. It reads very differently probably than it did at the time. You know, we've talked about the release of this film being released in to European audiences and then being released to American audiences. And at the time, you go back and you read contemporary reviews of it over there versus here, and you see that there, you know, it had a European sensibility. It was set in Europe. It had kind of those sense of that sense of morality to some degree, I guess, for whatever that's worth. But it was well received over there. In fact, it was embraced, and its artistic vision and kind of the references that the film made were, you know, a little more. The European audiences sort of knew that history, knew that mythology. That was part of their, you know, upbringing and education, and they could understand those references probably more than here. It was probably a little more alienating to some degree, or just kind of people didn't know what to make of it or understand it. It was just so unusual. And her character, when we watch this film, you know, we've watched it, like we said, so many times, it does read very modern. She is a very self-aware character. She plays it willfully, a little capricious, you know, at times, but she's very much, she knows herself. She knows that with these men that are just obsessed with her. And you and I, the first time we watched it and kind of had a debrief, we were both like, weren't they just so annoying? Could they not just leave her alone? My goodness, and she tells them, look, I'm not going to make you happy. You need to go be with somebody like Janet. She's the one for you, not me. You're trying to possess me and own me. And I don't want that. I want to be in a more equitable relationship. I want to feel passion for someone. I want, you know, I know what I want, and you're not it. And don't try to be, because you're not going to be. And I'm not going to settle, you know, and that's just a really interesting kind of role. And it's very, you know, to some degree, it mirrors her own life. I mean, in her own life, she was ultimately very independent and, you know, lived her own life her way, you know, as the true Ava Gardner, which is really interesting when you think about that and this role. And I think that it's great that this film is getting reevaluated and rewatched. And I think certainly for us as modern female viewers of it, we read all these other things into it that perhaps the male critics who reviewed it back in 19 didn't see. But I think we both just really are drawn to this character, and it's really, really great. You know, talk a little bit about the chemistry of her character and James Mason, and how, you know, she's drawn to him, and how the portrayal of their relationship is so different than her relationship with the other male characters in the film.
Yeah, so all the other male characters, you know, like we said, were drawn to her and revolve around her and want to possess her and, you know, cling to her. Whereas the Flying Dutchman, Hendrik van der Zee, didn't. You know, when she first meets him, she's kind of pursuing him. She wants to know what his deal is, and he's very unbothered, very unsurprised that, you know, some naked woman just showed up on his ship. And he doesn't pursue her, and he doesn't cling to her. And as the film progresses and they both sort of realize, you know, how they're feeling for each other, and he knows, you know, that he's been cursed, and I think he knows she's some sort of reincarnation of his wife, or that they're destined to be together. He actually pushes her away to save her, because he can be released from his curse if he finds a woman who loves him enough to die for him. So he doesn't want her to do that, because he loves her as well. So he actually is the only one to try to distance himself from her. But she is just, they're, you know, it's supernatural how drawn together they are. And, you know, ultimately they end up together, but die. So.
Well, and you know, what's so interesting about their relationship, we talked about this is a very talky film. There's lots of language. and lots of dialogue. But in their interactions, it's very much about the quiet. It's about the glance, the longing, that kind of all the things that are unsaid. And you see that in their scenes together, because one of their scenes is just him at the bottom of the stairs and her walking down the stairs with the dog that she gives him, and there's no dialogue, but you feel the chemistry, the heat between these two characters, which is really interesting. And a sharp contrast to these other men who are talking about, their race car or their bullfights and how they're the greatest at this, that, or the other, and how they want to own her and possess her and all that. And you're right, he doesn't want that. He doesn't, that's not how he sees his relationship with her. And you can see why that would be attractive to Pandora within the film.
Yeah. Someone who's not attractive.
Beth, you're starting to have a little technical glitch. So if Lynell wants to hop back on for just a second. Hi, Lynell.
Hi, I actually have a question. Beth, if you want to go ahead and fix your little technical issue there.
You leave and come right back, gang.
Yeah, I have a question that you and I can a couple of questions actually from Sue. Sue wants to know, first of all, what happened to the portraits of Ava that were painted? Do we know what happened to those portraits?
That is a really great question, and I'm afraid to say I don't know. We have tried to find those and also find what happened to the Man Ray paintings that were unused, sketches.
I do know that the Man Ray painting that was used in the film was one of Ava's very favorite portraits of her. She loved that
photograph. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I think that's very interesting, something that we might want to do a little bit more research on. And Sue, we might be able to answer that question more completely after we get a little more time to research it and put that on our blog when we find out about that.
That's another, just to kind of piggyback on that, we've also really tried to find more information about the costumes, and we know of a couple costumes that are in a museum collection of the actual dress that she's wearing in that red. It's a beautiful red dress. It's got a huge kind of floor-length bodice, a fitted bodice, and then this big kind of bottom skirt to it. It's beautiful, and I can't remember what museum it's in, but it is in a private collection of a museum. And but the other costumes, which are just absolutely stunning, and as we mentioned earlier, have just so much detail. Those are on our radar. We'd love to know where those are or who has those. So, if anybody ever finds out or gets information, we're constantly researching. But, that's interesting with a lot of films. So many artifacts that are so important in the film, they just kind of disperse to the wind. And this film being made outside of the confines of the studio system and on location, you can kind of understand how those items wouldn't have been kept at necessarily at a studio. And this film was done through Romulus Films in Europe and then just released through MGM. So it wasn't an MGM like we said, it wasn't an MGM costume design or anything within the studio confines. So those things weren't held in the archives of the studio.
Yeah, and costumes were often kind of reworked and reused and things like that. So, who knows if it was kind of reworked for parts for something else.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have costumes in our collection, our permanent collection, that were designed within the studio system, but were used in a couple films, and then later reworked, add some fur, put some here and there, and then boom, you got a new costume. So that did happen quite a bit. Yes. So we've got Beth back. Yay.
Yes, guys, go back to your the rest of your chat. I do have another couple of questions, which we will at the end come back to those. Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We knew that Beth had a computer glitch the other day where it was like after an hour there might be
sound like a robot apparently.
She goes away, comes back, and everything's good. So we got her. But we were talking kind of through the characters and talking a little bit about the romantic elements of the film and the dynamic of James Mason's character and Ava's character. So we've covered a lot of ground with the film. You and I we could talk about this film all day because it's amazing and we love
all
it.
Day.
Let's get to a little bit about the exhibit. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the elements of the exhibit, and I'm going to switch hats and be more asking you questions and stuff. But tell us a little bit about the exhibit that we put together, what artifacts we have on it, and kind of the structure of it, and things you thought about as you were curating this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So exhibits come to life in a number of ways, and this one was inspired by a recent acquisition. Someone donated some jewelry to the museum, and I'll show that to you in just a minute. And so, this new acquisition is really beautiful. It was related to this film. Ava wore this jewelry on set and at the wrap party, and so we really wanted to share that with our visitors. So we're like, well, we should do some sort of exhibit where we can showcase this jewelry. And then the 2020 restoration of Pandora, which went into theaters like in February, so right before the pandemic.
Anyone that got to see it that's part of this conversation, I'm just going to say right here, I'm jealous. We were hoping to screen it at the local theater in Smithfield near the museum, and hopefully when things get back to normal and we're able to have our next Ava Gardner Festival, which it was going to be part of that last year. But when we have our next festival, hopefully we can screen it or something equivalent.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm jealous of anybody who got to see it on the big screen before.
It was released, I think, in New York and Los Angeles before things got a little crazy. But that came out in 2020. So we're like, this is a perfect time to re-examine this film, take a look at it. It's being shown to new audiences and in a really beautiful restoration. So we sort of made 2020 the year of Pandora, and we researched, and this exhibit opened in the fall. There's also a virtual version you can get to from our gift shop if you can't come visit us, and we're temporarily closed at the moment because of a little flood incident.
Everything's fine.
Everything's fine.
We just have to redo some carpet and some baseboards, but
yes. So in the grand scheme of things, not as bad as it certainly could have been. Mm-hmm. But so this exhibit, it was very relevant for the moment. It was a good time to make everything about Pandora. So the exhibit covers sort of four main categories. Ava's experience of filming, some personal things of hers from the making of the film, the marketing and promotion of the film, and this was a great way to showcase some of the ephemera in our collection that we don't get to use very often, because it wasn't Ava's personally. You could have purchased this sort of thing, magazines, things like that, if you were, living in 1951 and, a fan of films. And then we also cover that creative team that we talked about earlier. We talk a little bit about Al Lewin and Jack Cardiff and Man Ray in the exhibit. And then we touch on this restoration and what it means for new audiences. So those are the four categories. And like I said, it was inspired partly by this new acquisition. So I'm gonna share my screen with you guys and show you a few artifacts from this exhibit. Just a second, there we go. So this is the jewelry that we acquired in late 2019 from a donor. Now it does not appear in the finished version of the film. So we feel pretty confident that it is from some deleted scenes from the film. She definitely wore it while on set, and she wore it to the wrap party for the film, where she gave it to the wife of a production coordinator. I have several stories from things in our collection that she just gave away. She was very generous like that. Just, here, I'll just take this off and give it to you. So this is a matching set of clip-on silver wire earrings with little pearls at the center in this floral design with a matching brooch. And, it's just something that she wore and something very directly tied to this film through our provenance research. So we wanted to make sure we included this. And they're really beautiful, especially in person. And
right, and talking about kind of this artifact being part of the exhibit, let's I think we compiled a couple pictures of some of our favorite artifacts, our personally favorite, yours and mine, of items included.
You want to talk about your favorite? I think it's
Sure,
next in
yeah.
our little
I think I'm
slideshow.
first. Slides first, I think, yeah. So as Beth mentioned, what's really one of the things I particularly liked about this exhibit, I mean, of course, I love the costumes we're able to display, the personal items and artifacts from Ava's long life and career. We have a great mix of, items. One of the things that does make our museum particularly special is that it was founded by a fan. The bedrock of the collection was started by a husband and wife who knew Ava, who became friendly with Ava, who had a personal connection with Ava. And we share some great information about that on our website, about the history of the museum. And they started as fans and collectors. And he started as a collector when he found out this girl that he had met as a kid made it to Hollywood. So he had a long, life of collecting all sorts of artifacts, specifically from her films, but also memorabilia and things that would have been marketing materials and that sort of thing. And then as time went on, our collection and through other acquisitions and things, the museum expanded to have a lot of personal artifacts. So we're able to show both the professional career side of Ava Gardner's life, but also the personal side of it with her personal effects. So that's a really neat thing about our museum. But this exhibit in particular, we did get to put on display a lot of the ephemera that we have, which is something we refer to frequently in a lot of our social media outreach and work. We really try to reference that and share those artifacts because sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're harder to see or harder to represent in an exhibit case where you can't touch them and move them and flip through them and read a whole article and that sort of thing. But this exhibit lended itself really well to this type of sharing ephemera. And one of the items we had was this really cool color comic book that came out in conjunction with the release of the film. And these were they made comic books for several films back then. So we have a few in our collection from some of her other films as well. But this one in particular has just really beautiful illustrations. And what these books would do would be basically tell a condensed version of the film, of the plot points, and kind of highlight some of the key plot moments and some of the action scenes or romance scenes, that sort of thing. And it's just really neat to see how the comic book artist translated the film. In some cases, I mean, it's an exact match of how it appears in the film. So we did a couple highlights so you can see an interior page, and then there's a couple close-ups down below of three small sections within panels, where the first one is her saying, "Hello, is anyone there?" When she swims, strips off her clothes, jumps into the sea and swims up to his yacht for the first time. And that is pretty much identical to how it appears in the film. And then if you look, not the middle one, but the next one, you see the scene where she is reflected in a mirror and she's wearing sort of a tarp. And that's when she's gotten into the boat and is trying, introducing herself to Hendrik. And that's not exactly how it appears in the final movie, but it is, it's an artist interpretation or a comic book artist interpretation. So I just think this is a really cool artifact. It is something that if I were alive in 1951, I would have bought every one of these that came out. So it just really resonated with me as a designer and illustrator. It just really was something I just flipped out when I found it, when I saw it in our archives. So how about you? Which artifact speaks to you and why?
Yeah, so I have the privilege of handling a lot of things that Ava actually owned, touched, used, which is always really cool. And so my favorite from this exhibit is actually this envelope, which seems, kind of boring in comparison to some things. But this is Ava's handwriting on this envelope. This was her system for organizing her personal copies of photographs and mementos from her films. And, I just love how there's just so many little details on this. That she wrote 1949 or 50, because looking back, she couldn't quite remember what year she filmed this. That she calls Al Lewin instead of Albert. She lists herself there at the bottom of that list of all the stars, just as me. It's very down to earth, very, just human, that she just had this little system for keeping up with her stuff, just like you or I might organize like our family photos or something. So it's just really endearing and just a connection to her on a very human level. So I really, this is my favorite thing in the exhibit.
Well, and it's just so neat, you like you said, we keep looking at this artifact and finding new little things, that she specifies that Sheila Sim was married to Richard Attenborough. That's something she thought, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to write that on here. And there's little spelling errors or cross outs like, wait, no, that's not how you spell it. Let me mark that out. And it is just a very personal, very human item. And it's so neat to see her handwriting. And to know this was her system of organizing, pre-digital files and everything like that. This is how let me get an envelope. And she was quite well known within her family and friends of writing things on little pieces of paper, little scraps of paper, tucking papers and books and things. And we found things within our collection, even after we've, kind of cataloged them, like, oh, wait, look what's in here. Look what's tucked in here. And it's great that, that we have these little touches of her, these little personal elements or personal artifacts that were truly her hand. She touched her, we know her filing system with this artifact. So I think that's a great one to share with everyone.
Okay. Yeah. So is there anything else? I know we're coming up on an hour here.
Yeah, well, I'll just say real quick, you did mention earlier that 2020 was the year of Pandora. So we have spent this past year sharing some of these artifacts. When we did acquire the jewelry before we planned this exhibit, we shared that on our blog and did a little release about that and kind of the provenance of that artifact. So if anybody's interested in reading more about that, they can check that article out on our blog. As you mentioned, we decided to turn this exhibit into our very first virtual exhibit. So why don't you talk just a little bit about that, how folks can access that, and how we were, what about this exhibit translated well to that format?
Yeah, like you said earlier, this exhibit was a good one to use ephemera in and things. And that translated really well to virtual because so many of these items are 2D. They could scan really nice resolution images of them. So when you go into the virtual exhibit, you can almost see things better than you can in the physical exhibit. You can see more pages from things. We included extra pages. There's a couple of extra artifacts. With virtual, we could also include links. I think we linked to that article about the acquisition. We linked to a trailer for the film, so you can kind of get a feel for how the restoration looks. It just translated really, really well. It includes everything that you would see if you were able to come in person, plus a little extra. And plus you can make these pictures bigger. You can kind of get a zoomed in look at things. So I mean, it came out really, really well. Not to toot my own horn, but you can access that virtual exhibit through our gift shop from our website at avagardner.org.
Mm-hmm. And again, just kind of piggybacking on the year of Pandora, we did produce some really unique items for our gift shop this year that are in stock. And, we did it leading up to the holidays, but they're going to be in stock the rest of the year. Our 2021 calendar has everything, is totally focused on Pandora. So if you want to see some great pictures and some of the art, pictures we referenced during our conversation, some of those are in the calendar this year. We did a mug, a face mask, very topical face mask, a series of Ava Gardner Museum buttons that feature some of the imagery of Pandora, mentioned a mug and some other things. And then we've done a lot on our social media about Pandora throughout the year, and I'm sure that will continue as we have other kind of things to share about this story and this film. And then we had a really great piece contributed from the film curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art. She was kind enough to be a guest blogger for us and wrote a really great in-depth article about all the artistic references within the film and influences beyond Man Ray and some of his other surrealist contemporaries. That's on our blog as well. So I highly encourage anyone who's interested in that topic or would like to learn more about the film and its influences and its lasting impact. Definitely check that out. So now that we've kind of covered a lot of ground, and like I said, we could talk about this all day because we both are very passionate about this film. Let's welcome back Lynell and see if we had any other questions or anything else that Lynell would like to add.
Yeah, actually, we have a couple of questions that I can address, and you guys can chime in as you like. Again, from Sue, we had a question that I thought was really an interesting question. People never ask this. After the fact, did Ava ever mention her feelings about the film, and was she proud of her performance in the film? And I know from what I have read in Renee Jordan's book, which was Living with Miss G, and it's about her life living with Ava Gardner. She does mention that Ava enjoyed working on the film and she liked her character and she loved the fact that she got to sing, as Beth mentioned earlier. She sang the song How Am I to Know in her own voice, which I thought perfectly fit the song. And actually she did enjoy. And also, filming Pandora really introduced Ava to life on the other side of the pond, and she loved England and she loved Spain, and ended up at the end of her life, she moved to Spain first, lived there for several years, and at the end of her life, she was living in England, and she never lived in the United States again, although she came back for visits on a frequent basis to see her family in North Carolina, but she never lived here after she made that move. And it started with the filming of Pandora. So great questions, Sue, really good questions. And then I want to make sure I'm saying this right. Risty had a question. Let me pop that up real quick so I make sure I get it right. She was curious about showing the movie and broadcasting it so that people can sign up to see it. She actually said, after hearing all the details, I'm so ready to watch it and look for them. The problem with us showing movies is we have to pay a license fee whenever we show a movie. So typically we will do that when we have a big event, when we have something along the lines of our annual festival, which unfortunately we didn't do in 2020, but we are certainly going to bring that back. And that would be one of the things that we would do is have a film typically as part of our festival. But because we have to the license fee, it would have to be kind of a bigger event for that. So,
but let everybody know, we do have the latest Blu-ray edition that was released through Cohen that we referenced. It is absolutely stunning, and that is available in our gift shop. So if anyone is interested in owning a copy, and I'm glad I have a copy because I've watched the movie a bunch, and it's nice to have a handy copy. We do try to let everyone know when her films are playing, particularly on Turner Classic Movies. We scour through their schedule leading up to every month and try to align some of our content with things that are going to be relevant to folks watching her films when they air. So if the movie's going to be on, we'll certainly alert our fans. If you follow us on, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or our website, we sometimes don't necessarily do announcements on that, but we do have, relevant content, and you can link to all of our social media feeds through our website, avagardner.org. So we'll keep you posted if it's playing, and hopefully we'll be able to do a screening at some point in the not so far future in Ava's hometown.
And TCM is a great resource for any classic movies, but if you're looking for Ava Gardner movies, certainly keep up on their schedule, because they do show Ava movies frequently. So, and again, our social media will be able to give you a heads up on that, and certainly go to our gift shop. We have a lot of movies. We have DVDs of all the Ava movies that we can get a hold of. We've got them. So thank you, ladies. You guys were great. I really appreciate all the information. I definitely want to especially thank our attendees for coming today and experiencing our very first Ava Chats. We do really appreciate your support of the Ava Gardner Museum. We will post more information on our blog at avagardner.org, and we will also be sending each of you a link to a recording of this episode. I wanted to mention real quick, Lora, that Anna wants you to know that your turquoise is divine.
Thank you. My Christmas gift for my husband. It's my first time wearing it. So thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. I'll let him know you said that.
And Please be sure to follow us on social media, keep up with us there. And you can also go to avagardner.org for links to our gift shop or more information about Ava's life, her career, and certainly the Ava Gardner Museum. We really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope you guys, all of you, have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.